pave paradise and put up a parking lot? This is a dilemma a lot of American cities face, and I'm not going to run on about parking minimums and zoning laws because I've seen enough videos that cover quite well why parking lots suck. This channel was originally formed with the intent of sharing cool things cities do, so I'm going to do just that. In an ideal city, walking and public transportation should be sufficient for getting around. However, the reality is that some people require parking, whether due to distance, age, or mobility constraints. This necessity prompts cities to explore creative approaches to parking management. This clearly isn't ideal, so let's explore some of the best ways I've encountered cities handling their parking needs. Shared parking is an innovative model that optimizes existing parking spaces. Often, parking minimums are set based on peak occupancy, leading to oversupply in many areas. Your parking stall at home is empty while you're at work, and your parking stall at the office is empty all night. But these stalls aren't public, so despite there being empty spaces, there never seems to be enough. We really don't need to require new parking spaces to be built if we can just utilize existing stalls better. An office building next to an apartment building could share the same parking structure and get more utility out of it. Seoul is kind of known for parking shortages, so much so that they sometimes double park and leave their cars in neutral. This is definitely an alternative parking model, though not the one I'm recommending in this video. Anyhow, the past few years, they've been really advocating for shared parking. This woman works at City Hall and parks her car at the nearby apartment complex. After business hours, residents of that apartment who might have had trouble securing a parking spot otherwise can park at City Hall. It's a win-win for the residents and the employees. They have rolled out the Seoul Parking Information app that allows house and landowners to make some extra money by renting out parking. Shared parking avoids building unnecessary parking and encourages better utilization of what we already have, which to me should be the first consideration. But what if you determine that you actually do need a parking structure? For example, Convoy Street in San Diego is essentially a stroad, but a stroad full of trendy Asian restaurants and a serious lack of parking. Typically, how it goes is my friends and I struggle to find parking for our dinner spot. Then after dinner, we want to try a new dessert place. The dessert place is maybe a 5 to 10 minute walk down the street, but because we parked in a private lot, we can't leave our cars and walk to another complex or risk getting towed. Instead, we drive 30 seconds down the road and circle for parking for another 10 minutes all to get dessert. As someone who has lived in walkable cities, this is absolutely absurd to me, but when even my friends comment on the terrible design, I know it's bad. This street could be so much better if there were a couple of central parking structures and the street was more pedestrian friendly. Having a central parking structure or two is far better than having multiple lots that break up your street and create a stroad. Now, I am a big fan of mixed-use buildings, so if we must have a giant parking structure, why not at least make the ground floor productive? Rather than this, we can have something like this. By combining parking with retail or other commercial spaces, these structures enhance street-level activity and pedestrian friendliness. The idea is to avoid multiple disconnected parking lots that disrupt the urban fabric and contribute to stroads. Maybe we can even convert existing garages into these. Now, if we don't want to use a lot of area for parking, building up is the obvious solution, but have you ever noticed that you don't see a lot of parking garages in European cities? That's because they build down. So I'm going to take you back to one of my favorite cities, Bilbao. I've done a video previously on some of the infrastructure improvements Bilbao has made, but one thing I didn't mention was the underground parking. Bilbao city centre, like many European cities, consists of mid-rise mixed-use buildings that don't exactly have enough street parking to accommodate all who live there. What's great is they have public parking structures for the residents, and what's even better is that these structures are below ground. This is Castillo de Utilizar Parkea in Bilbao. It's surrounded by the river on one side and the major shopping street on the other, and underneath, you guessed it, it's parking. They've got another lot in the city center beneath this little plaza, and with only a few designated entrances and exits that are not on the main street, it's secure and it helps keep the area pedestrian friendly. One of the issues brought up in this Great Strong Towns video was that they were proposing to replace one of the major parking lots with a park in the central area of Fayetteville. Naturally, some people were not happy about that, but here's an example that shows you can have both. So Fayetteville, you can have a park and your parking too, civil engineering permitting. If you're wondering why we don't just do underground parking in the first place, it's because it's more complicated than parking lots and open-air structures. First of all, depending on your city, you might not even be able to dig without hitting water. If you are able to build an underground parking garage, it will be more expensive because you need ventilation. With open-air garages, you have natural ventilation, but with underground garages, builders will need to install HVAC, which has added capital and operations and maintenance costs. Typically, these costs and permits can be justified in city centers where land is very expensive. Tax money they'd bring in from removing parking minimums would more than offset an underground parking structure. But in suburban areas where land is cheap, these costs can create too much hassle for private developers to consider going underground. That's why we end up with parking like this and suburban neighborhoods that are not built to human scale. So let's say you don't want to dig all the way underground for the reasons mentioned previously. There are alternative solutions, like this. Honolulu built a park on top of a parking structure. I've seen a version of this in Bilbao too. You can get pretty creative with it. Atlanta's structure is below ground at street level, but an open-air structure on the other side. And if you watch this video, you know that people do gravitate toward high places, so if you can turn it into some kind of attraction, there's that. Now, the previous models are all centered around parking structures which are infrastructure intense. They require a considerable amount of construction, reinforcement, commitment, and investment. Or do they? Say there's definitely need for a parking structure now, but you expect that in the next 10 years, public transport will improve and demand for parking will decrease. What would you do? Is there such a thing as a temporary parking structure? Usually, parking structures are these behemoth structures made from concrete, but here's what I saw in Okinawa. Steel parking structures. Steel parking structures have lower construction costs, lower maintenance costs, and have a higher parking density. They can also be disassembled with relative ease compared to a concrete structure. Seems to me to be a good alternative if you think parking minimums might be removed in the future and you want to be flexible with your land. And the Japanese really do know how to maximize their land, because walking around Japan, I also saw a lot of these. These are called vertical parking, and unlike a parking structure, you don't drive your car up and down. It's more like an elevator or lift for your car. If you live in a mid-rise apartment building, there might be a small lift that can fit 6 or so cars. And for city parking, there are more sophisticated systems known as vertical automated parking that allow you to pull in and it'll store your car for you. The obvious benefit here is space and density. The fact that these structures are not designed for human use means you don't need to meet the same standards for ramps, elevators, stairways, lighting, and ventilation. You also avoid criminal activity in parking garages. Every city faces unique parking challenges, and there's no one-size-fits-all solution. By adopting a mix of these creative parking models, cities can work toward efficient and sustainable parking solutions tailored to their needs. And if your city is super ambitious, it could go for a combination of these parking models, like this award-winning underground automated parking in Munich, which was built in under 2 years. Or this automated underground parking structure in Denmark located under the city library. Or maybe this park and play garage, also in Denmark, which might be a model for retrofitting existing garages into better spaces. Which of these approaches might work best in your city, and have you come across any other unique parking solutions in your travels?